Did a hidden photo reveal a long-buried secret that tore my family apart? It's strange how something as simple as a photograph can tear your life apart. I always thought that pictures were supposed to preserve moments, happy moments. Moments of pride. Moments worth remembering. That's what they were meant for, right? But this photo, the one I found buried in a shoebox under a pile of old letters and yellowed papers, it wasn't like that. It was a moment that wasn't supposed to exist. A moment that had been hidden away for so many years. And when I discovered it, I didn't know that it would explode my family in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. My family had always been a little fractured, but I suppose most families are. We were close enough, at least on the surface. We lived in a small town in Mexico, a place where everyone knows everyone's business, or at least they think they do. My mother, Rosa, was the quiet type, always working in the garden or in the kitchen. She kept the house spotless, as if that was her way of controlling the chaos around her. My father, Carlos, was harder to pin down. He worked as a mechanic, and he loved to tinker with things. He was distant in a way that felt normal to me growing up. But now I realized that distance hid something darker, something I hadn't even thought to question. I was the oldest of 3 children. My younger sister, Maria, was always so full of life, bouncing from one thing to the next, chasing dreams she barely had time to form before moving on to the next. And my brother, Diego, he was the quiet one. Much like my mother, he kept to himself, always with his nose in a book or out wandering the hills just beyond town. We weren't a perfect family by any means, but I thought we were strong. I thought we knew each other. How wrong I was. It all started innocently enough, as these things often do. I was cleaning out the attic, a task I had been putting off for years. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the items were familiar old toys, Christmas decorations, and my abuela's sewing machine, long and used. But there was one box I didn't recognize. It was tucked away in the farthest corner, hidden under a pile of blankets that smelled faintly of mildew. I pulled it out, curious. The cardboard was worn, and the edges were soft from age. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. Inside were stacks of letters, old documents, and photographs. At first, they seemed harmless enough, pictures of my parents when they were young, before I was born. Letters from relatives long since passed. But then I found it, the photo that changed everything. It was an old black and white picture, slightly blurred, as if the person taking it had been in a hurry. There, in the center, stood a man and a woman. The woman was my mother. I could tell by the shape of her face, even though she was much younger, maybe in her early 20s. She was smiling, but there was something in her expression that felt off, like she wasn't truly happy. And then there was the man. It wasn't my father. At first, I thought it must have been some relative, someone I didn't recognize. But the way they stood together, the way his arm was wrapped around her waist, it didn't feel like that. There was an intimacy in the photo that was unmistakable, something that I couldn't ignore. And that's when I noticed the date scrawled on the back of the picture. It was from a few months before I was born. My heart stopped. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man in the picture, he wasn't just a friend or a relative. He was something more. I could feel it in my bones, even though I didn't want to believe it. I could feel the cracks in my understanding of my family starting to form, and I didn't know how to stop them. I spent the next few hours going through every piece of paper in that box, searching for answers. There were more letters, more photos, all of them pointing to the same undeniable truth. The man in the photo wasn't just anyone. He was my mother's lover. And worse than that, he was my real father. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the evidence in front of me. My mind was racing, trying to fit the pieces together. Everything I had known about my family, about who I was, felt like it had been ripped away in an instant. How could my mother have hidden something like this from us? From me? How could my father Carlos have lived with this lie for so many years? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Carlos wasn't my father. He had raised me, cared for me, been there for me through everything. And yet, he wasn't my blood. And the man in the photo, the man whose name I didn't even know, he was the one responsible for my existence. I wanted to scream, to tear the house apart. But instead, I just sat there, numb. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the weight of the secret pressed down on my chest until I could hardly breathe. How could this have been kept from me for so long? How could my mother have lived with this lie? Days passed in a blur. I tried to act normal, to pretend like nothing had changed. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at my mother, I felt a wave of anger and betrayal rise up in me. She didn't know that I had found the photo. She didn't know that her secret had been uncovered. And I didn't know how to confront her about it. I avoided her as much as I could. But it was impossible to avoid my own thoughts. They consumed me, haunted me, day and night. I kept replaying my childhood in my mind, searching for signs, for moments when I should have realized something was off. But there was nothing. No clues. No hints. My mother had played her role perfectly. She had been the perfect wife, the perfect mother. And all the while, she had been hiding this secret. I didn't know how to face Carlos. He had been the only father I had ever known. The man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who had taken me fishing, who had stood by me through every major event in my life. And yet, he wasn't my father. The thought made me sick. But the secret was like a ticking time bomb. I knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. The more I thought about it, the more it ate away at me. Until finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I wasn't even sure how it happened. One moment, we were sitting at the dinner table, my family chatting casually about nothing important. And the next, the words were spilling out of my mouth before I could stop them. I found a photo. I said, a photo of Mom and another man. A man who isn't Dad. The room went silent. The air seemed to thicken, and I could feel the tension rising like a wave about to crash. My mother's face turned pale, and I saw the fear in her eyes. She knew exactly what photo I was talking about. Carlos, my father. Or rather, the man I had always thought was my father just sat there, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand answers. He just sat there, staring at the table, as if he had known all along. As if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the truth to come out. In that moment, my family shattered. The pieces of our lives, our relationships, fell apart in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was the sound of years of lies, of hidden truths, of betrayal. And I knew, in that moment, that things would never be the same. My mother eventually admitted to the affair, to the fact that the man in the photo was my biological father. She had kept it a secret for years, thinking it was the best thing for all of us. She had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that Carlos was my real father in every way that counted. But to me, it mattered. It mattered more than anything. Carlos never said a word. He just left. He packed a bag and walked out the door. And I haven't seen him since. I don't know where he went. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. The man who raised me, the man who had been my father in every way that mattered, was gone. And I was left with the weight of the truth. The guilt of having blown my family apart with a single photograph. As for my mother, we barely speak. The house feels empty, haunted by the ghosts of the past, by the secrets that had been buried for so long. I try to move on, to pretend like life can go back to normal. But it can't. Not after everything that's happened. In the end, it wasn't the photograph that destroyed my family. It was the lies, the secrets, the things left unsaid for so many years. The photo was just a spark that ignited the fire. The final piece of a puzzle that had been falling apart for as long as I can remember. And now, All I'm left with are the ashes of the life I thought I knew. The pieces of a family that will never be whole again.